The dust of Redemption Creek tasted like broken promises. It coated the unpainted planks of the buildings, settled in the creases of worn-out hopes, and billowed up in choking clouds with every gust of wind from the plains. It was a town built on the frantic, greedy edge of progress, a temporary scar on the land where the railroad was clawing its way west. Caleb felt the grit between his teeth and ignored it. He ignored most things about this town. He came down from his mountain solitude only when necessity demanded it, for salt, for flour, for cartridges. Today, the necessity felt like a raw ache in his chest, a ghost of a memory he could not shake. He stood in the long shadow of the mercantile's porch, a tall, quiet figure carved from the same hard granite as his high country home. His buckskins were worn and faded, blending with the muted browns and greys of the landscape. He was a man made for silence and space, and the compressed, noisy humanity of the street scraped at his nerves. He had concluded his business. He should have been on his way back up the trail, back to the clean air and the quiet sorrow that was his only trusted companion. But he stayed. He watched. Across the street, in the stark, unforgiving sunlight, the reason for his delay was playing out like a piece of theater designed by the devil himself. A man named Thorne, a slick agent for the railroad with a face that was all sharp angles and predatory smiles, stood over a woman and two small children. The woman, Ilara, was young, with the kind of fragile beauty that life out here seemed determined to shatter. Her dress was clean but patched, her hands clutching those of her children, a boy and a girl, twins by the look of them, no older than 5. They were mirror images of fear, their small faces pale beneath the grime of the road. Thorne held a sheaf of papers, and he waved them like a weapon. Caleb had heard the story in muttered whispers inside the mercantile. Ilara's husband, a good man by all accounts, had taken a loan from the railroad to finance his small claim. He had died in a rockslide 2 months prior, leaving her with the debt. Now, Thorne was here to collect. But he was not collecting money. He was collecting people. "The contract is clear, madam," Thorne's voice carried across the dusty space, slick and condescending. "The debt transfers. In lieu of payment, your husband pledged his assets. That includes his family's labor. Indenture. It is all perfectly legal." Caleb's hands, resting on the porch rail, tightened into fists. The knuckles went white. He knew the law of the frontier was often a twisted, cruel thing, a tool for the powerful to use against the weak. He had seen it before. But this was a desecration. The sight of the mother, her shoulders squared against an impossible force, and the 2 children hiding behind her skirts, sent a lance of ice-cold memory through him. Another woman. Another child. A fever that stole them both and left him with nothing but the echoing silence of a cabin that was once a home. The past was a wound that never closed. It was a winter inside him that never thawed. He had retreated to the mountain to contain it, to keep its jagged edges from harming anyone else. He had built walls of solitude and silence around his heart, and for years, they had held. Now, watching the scene unfold, he felt the first cracks appear in that fortress of grief. The protective instinct he thought had been buried with his family stirred, a sleeping giant roused by the cries of the innocent. Thorne reached out and grabbed Ilara's arm. She flinched but did not cry out. The little boy, however, stepped forward, his tiny fists clenched. "Let go of my mama," he yelled, his voice thin but fierce. Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. He shoved the boy lightly, sending him stumbling back against his sister. "You'll learn your play soon enough, whelp." That was it. That was the moment the ice inside Caleb shattered. He did not think. He did not plan. He simply moved. He stepped off the porch, his worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. He crossed the street in a dozen long, silent strides. His shadow fell over Thorne before the man even realized he was there. Ilara felt a sudden chill, a blotting out of the harsh sun. She looked up and saw him. He was a mountain-made man, broad-shouldered and taller than anyone she had ever seen. His face was all harsh lines and angles, framed by a dark beard, and his eyes were the color of a stormy winter sky. They were fixed on the railroad agent. He said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was a statement, a raw, physical declaration of intent. Thorn, startled, let go of her arm. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his authority. This is no concern of yours, stranger. This is official railroad business. He brandished the papers again. I have the documents. Caleb's gaze did not waver. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together deep in the earth. Let her go. It was not a request. It was a command that hung in the hot, still air, absolute and final. Thorn sneered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes warring with his arrogance. And who are you to tell me what to do? Get back to your trapping, mountain man. The law is the law. Caleb ignored him. He looked at Ilara, his stormy eyes softening for a fraction of a second. It was a look that acknowledged her terror, her fight, her dignity. Then he stepped between her and Thorn, a silent, unmovable wall of buckskin and resolve. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and drew out a small, heavy deerskin bag. He tossed it onto the dusty ground at Thorn's feet. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. Gold. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the street. People had stopped, watching from doorways and windows. The clink of coins was a language everyone understood. That covers the debt, Caleb stated. He did not look at the bag. He looked at Thorn, his expression unreadable but radiating a cold, clear warning. Thorn stared at the bag, his greed momentarily overriding his anger. He bent to snatch it up, weighing it in his hand. It was far more than the original loan. It was a small fortune. A smug, triumphant look replaced his fury. He had been publicly challenged, but he was walking away with a profit. As you wish, he said with a dismissive shrug. The debt is paid. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture toward Ilara. But as he turned to leave, his eyes met Caleb's one last time. This is not over, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Caleb watched him stride toward the railroad office, his back rigid. The danger had passed, but only for a moment. He knew men like Thorn. Their pride was as valuable to them as their gold. He had made an enemy. He turned to the woman and her children. They were staring at him, their faces a mixture of shock, relief, and a new, more profound fear. Who was this man? What did he want from them now? His gaze fell on the twins, their wide, uncertain eyes fixed on his. The boy who had tried to defend his mother. The girl who trembled behind her. He felt the old, familiar ache in his chest, but this time, it was different. It was not just grief. It was responsibility. He had stepped into their lives, and he could not simply walk away. He knelt, bringing his formidable presence down to their level. His voice was softer now, the roughness sanded away. You're with me now, he said, the words a simple statement of fact. A promise. He looked at Ilara, his eyes asking for her trust, a thing he knew he had not yet earned. You are safe. Ilara stared at the stranger, this mountain that had risen from the dust to shield them. The gold he had thrown at Thorn's feet was more money than she had ever seen. He had bought their freedom, but she could not shake the terrifying question, had he simply bought them for himself? She was a piece of property a moment ago, and she felt like one still, just transferred to a new owner. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her fear of Thorn was a hot, sharp thing. Her fear of this man was cold and vast, like the mountain ranges he so clearly came from. His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw no hint of the predatory gleam she'd seen in Thorn's. She saw something else, something shuttered and ancient. It looked like pain. He stood up, his full height once again blocking out the world. He did not wait for an answer. He simply turned and began walking toward the trail that led out of town and up into the high peaks, assuming they would follow. For a terrifying second, she considered staying, taking her chances in the town. But one look back at the railroad office, where Thorn had disappeared, erased that thought. The town had watched. No one had helped. This silent stranger was the only one who had stood for them. She took a deep breath, the dust filling her lungs, and tugged on the hands of her children. "Come," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Leo and Lily, their small faces pale with exhaustion and confusion, obeyed without question. They hurried to catch up to the man's long, relentless stride. The journey began in a silence that was heavier than any words. The trail climbed steeply, leaving the noise and stench of Redemption Creek behind. The air grew thin and clean, smelling of pine and cold stone. The world became a place of immense vertical lines, towering trees, sheer rock faces, the deep blue of the sky. Caleb moved with an easy, powerful grace, his boots sure on the uneven ground. He did not look back to see if they were following. He seemed to know they had no other choice. After an hour, Lily began to stumble, her small legs unable to keep pace. Before Elara could say a word, Caleb stopped. He turned, and without speaking, he swooped down and lifted the little girl into his arms. Lily, too weary to be afraid, sagged against his broad shoulder and was asleep within moments. He adjusted her weight as if she were nothing more than a feather and resumed his climb. Leo, seeing his sister held so securely, moved a little closer to the man's side, his small hand occasionally brushing against the man's buckskin-clad leg. Elara watched this exchange with a tangled knot of emotions. The gesture was one of simple, unthinking kindness. It was at odds with his forbidding appearance, with the raw power that seemed to emanate from him. She did not know his name. She did not know what he wanted. She only knew that for the first time in months, her children were not in immediate peril. She walked on, her own exhaustion a dull ache in every muscle, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. They reached his cabin as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the western peaks. It was a small, solid structure built of thick, hand-hewn logs, tucked into a grove of aspens beside a rushing creek. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a welcome plume against the cooling sky. It was a place of profound isolation, beautiful and terrifying in its remoteness. Inside, it was sparse and impeccably clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and shelves holding a few books and neatly stacked supplies. A single bed, covered with thick furs, was built into the far wall. Caleb gently laid the sleeping Lily onto the bed. He turned to Elara. "This is yours," he said, gesturing to the bed and the small, private space. "I will sleep by the fire." He moved to the hearth, adding another log to the flames, his back to her. He was giving her space, giving her the only private and secure place in his home. It was another act of quiet consideration that chipped away at the wall of her fear. She helped Leo out of his dusty jacket and sat him on one of the chairs. He was asleep almost instantly, his head lolling onto the table. Elara stood in the middle of the small room, feeling utterly adrift. This was his home. His sanctuary. And they had invaded it. "We are a burden to you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "You paid the debt. You do not owe us anything more." Caleb turned from the fire. The flames lit one side of his face, leaving the other in deep shadow. "Eat," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He gestured to a pot simmering on the hearth. "Then rest. We will talk when the sun is up." He did not engage her fears or her gratitude. He addressed their immediate, physical needs. Food. Warmth. Safety. For now, it was enough. She ladled some of the savory stew into bowls. It was rich with venison and wild roots. As she and Leo ate, the simple warmth of the food spread through her, a balm to her frayed soul. She watched the man by the fire. He seemed to be a part of the stillness, a figure of stone and shadow, but she was beginning to see the man beneath the mountain. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun over the jagged peaks. A fragile routine began to form. Caleb would rise before dawn and disappear into the forest, returning hours later with game or firewood. He never intruded on their space within the cabin, never made them feel unwelcome. He spoke little, but his actions were a language she was beginning to understand. He repaired the sole of Leo's worn-out boot. He showed her where the wild berries grew thickest. He left a pail of fresh, cold water from the creek by the door each morning. One afternoon, she found him sitting on the porch step, a block of pine in one hand and a knife in the other. He was carving. With deft, patient strokes, he was coaxing a shape from the wood. She watched in silence as a small bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight, emerged from the block. He sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone and then began another. When he had two, he held them out to Leo and Lily without a word. The children, who had been watching him from a cautious distance, crept forward. They took the wooden birds, their faces filled with a solemn wonder. It was the first gift they had received since their father's death. It was a moment of unsolicited kindness, an offering that asked for nothing in return. Later that week, a cold autumn rain settled over the mountains, trapping them inside for 2 days. The cabin was filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The children, restless, played quietly on the floor with their carved birds. Ilara sat at the table, mending a tear in Lily's dress. Caleb sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic, metallic clicks the only sound besides the drumming rain. The quiet was comfortable now, not menacing. That night, after the children were asleep in the big fur-covered bed, Ilara woke to a strange sound. It was a low, guttural noise, one of immense pain. She sat up, her heart pounding. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, red light through the cabin. Caleb was not in his bedroll by the hearth. She saw him standing by the single window, his back to her, his wide shoulders shaking. He was holding something. A small, worn object. In the faint light, she could see what it was. A child's boot, much smaller than Leo's. He made the sound again, a raw, stifled sob that he fought to hold back. He was a man drowning in a grief so deep and so private she felt like a trespasser for even witnessing it. She understood then. The pain in his eyes, the solitude, the silent kindness towards her children. He was not just a protector, he was a father who had lost everything. He did not have to tell her his story. She could see it in the way he clutched that tiny boot as if it were the last anchor in a raging sea. She said nothing. She lay back down and pulled the furs over her head, granting him the privacy of his sorrow. But in the darkness, a profound shift occurred within her. Her fear of him was gone, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. They were two broken people, washed up on the shores of a shared tragedy. And in this remote, silent cabin, they were, perhaps, each other's only hope for healing. Weeks turned into a month. The aspens outside the cabin turned from green to a brilliant, shimmering gold. A fragile peace settled in the small clearing, a sense of belonging that Ilara had not felt since before her husband's death. She made the cabin her own in small ways, hanging herbs to dry from the rafters, baking bread in the small stone oven beside the hearth. Leo and Lily, their fear long forgotten, now treated Caleb with a familiar, trusting affection. They would follow him as he chopped wood, chattering away to him, and he would listen, his replies short but never dismissive. The silence of the cabin had been replaced by the quiet hum of a life being rebuilt. The peace was shattered by the thunder of a horse's hooves. A rider, a trapper who sometimes used the lower trails, brought a notice from town. It was an official document from the territorial court, nailed crudely to a piece of board. Caleb took it, his face hardening into a mask of stone as he read the legalistic script. Ilara watched him, a cold dread creeping back into her heart. She saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, the way his hand clenched around the notice. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Thorn," he said, the name a curse on his lips. He handed her the document. Her eye scanned the words, her limited reading ability enough to piece together the terrifying meaning. Marcus Thorn had filed a formal claim. He declared Caleb's payment of the debt an illegal act of coercion. He claimed the original contract, which he had now falsified, was an unbreakable indenture agreement, making her and her children his legal property. A hearing was set. The territorial judge was coming to Redemption Creek in 2 weeks. They were ordered to present themselves, or be hunted as fugitives. The world tilted on its axis. The safety she had cultivated, the fragile home she had begun to build, was a mirage. The law, the piece of paper that had ruined her life once, had returned to do it again. She looked at Caleb, expecting to see defeat. Instead, she saw a cold, burning fire in his winter sky eyes. It was not the fire of rage, but of pure, unyielding resolve. He would not let this happen. The next morning, before the sun had crested the eastern peaks, he was gone. He left a stack of firewood by the door and a freshly dressed rabbit on the table. A silent promise that he would provide, that he would return. He journeyed down the mountain, his mind a sharp, focused instrument. He needed an ally. He needed information. He went to the Mercantile, the only place in Redemption Creek that held any semblance of honor. Sarah, the widow who ran it, was a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard years and quiet wisdom. She had known Caleb's wife, Mary, and had grieved with the whole mountain community when she and their daughter were taken by the winter fever. She saw Caleb walk in, and her expression softened with a sad understanding. "Caleb," she said, her voice warm. "It has been too long." He did not waste time on pleasantries. He placed the notice on her counter. "Thorn," he said. Sarah read it, her lips thinning into a grim line. "That devil," she breathed. "He's done this before, you know. Not with people, not this brazenly. But he uses those contracts to bleed people dry, to take their land, their equipment. He is the railroad smiling jackal. Everyone is too afraid of the company to fight back." She looked up at him, her gaze sharp. "But no one has ever had the stomach for a real fight. And no one has ever had proof." "Proof?" Caleb asked. "Thorn is arrogant," Sarah explained, leaning closer and lowering her voice. "He's a meticulous record keeper. Brags about it. He has a ledger in his office. A big, leather-bound book where he details every deal, every loan, every squeeze. He sees it as a testament to his own cleverness. If that ledger contains the truth of Ilara's contract, not the forgery he's filed with the court, it would ruin him. It would prove a pattern of fraud." Caleb's eyes narrowed. The path forward became clear, a dangerous, single track through enemy territory. He did not need a lawyer. He needed a truth that was heavier than Thorn's lies. He needed the ledger. He gave Sarah a curt nod of thanks, his mind already working through the logistics of what he had to do. He bought a few provisions, his movements economical and precise. As he was leaving, Sarah touched his arm. "Caleb," she said softly. "What you are doing?" Mary would be proud. The name was a physical blow, a fresh stab of the old grief. But for the first time, it did not send him retreating into himself. It strengthened his resolve. He was doing this for Ilara and her children, but he was also doing it to honor the man he was supposed to be, the man Mary had loved. That night, a sliver of moon offered little light. Redemption Creek was asleep, save for the low rumble of the saloon. Caleb moved through the back alleys like a ghost, a shadow among shadows. The railroad office was a squat, imposing building near the half-finished tracks. A single lamp burned in a window. Caleb watched it for a long hour, memorizing the movements of the lone night watchman. When the man left on his rounds, Caleb slipped from the darkness. He did not break the lock, he coaxed it open with a thin piece of steel from his pack, a skill learned from years of repairing his own traps. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of cigar smoke and ink. He moved directly to Thorn's desk. It was large and ornate, a monument to the man's ego. He searched the drawers quickly, silently. Nothing. His eye scanned the room. On a shelf behind the desk, among geological surveys and maps, sat a single, thick book bound in dark green leather. The ledger. He took it down. It was heavy in his hands, heavy with the weight of stolen livelihoods and broken families. He opened it. Thorn's handwriting was an elegant, precise script. He found Ilara's husband's name. And there it was. A simple loan for tools and seed, with the claim as collateral. No mention of indenture. No mention of family. A few pages later, a separate, damning entry, contract altered for Ia Hale. Indenture clause added. To be filed with territorial court. It was confession and proof, all in one. He heard the crunch of boots outside. The watchman was returning early. Caleb did not panic. He slid the ledger into his pack, slipped back through the office, and out the lockpick door, melting back into the shadows seconds before the watchman rounded the corner. He did not run back to the mountain. Not yet. His fight was not just for Ilara. It was for the whole town, whether they knew it or not. He took the ledger straight to Sarah's house behind the mercantile. He woke her with a soft knock. When she saw the book in his hands, her eyes widened. They sat at her kitchen table, and by the light of a single lantern, they read. Page after page revealed Thorne's predatory schemes. The blacksmith who had lost his wagon over a disputed shipping fee. The farmer whose water rights had been legally reassigned to the railroad. A dozen other small, cruel thefts, all meticulously documented. This is more than just about Ilara, Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and outrage. This is the soul of the town. He's been poisoning the well for years. They need to see, Caleb said. They need to stand. The next day, Sarah closed the mercantile. She and Caleb went first to the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Thomas whose hands could mend iron but who had been unable to fight a piece of paper. Caleb didn't speak. He simply opened the ledger to the page with Thomas's name on it. The blacksmith read it, his face flushing with a dark, furious red. He looked from the book to Caleb, and the fear that had kept him silent for a year was burned away by anger. That thieving snake, he growled. What do we do? We stand, Caleb said. At the hearing. We tell the truth. They went next to the baker, then to the stable owner, then to two farmers who had come into town for supplies. The reaction was the same. Fear, then a slow dawning anger, then a hardening of resolve. The sight of Thorne's own handwriting detailing his crimes was an irrefutable call to arms. The town's prejudice against Caleb, the reclusive mountain man, evaporated. They saw him not as an outsider, but as the one who had dared to bring the truth into the light. The community's conscience, long dormant, was stirring. While Caleb was forging this unlikely alliance in town, life in the cabin continued. Ilara found herself praying for his safe return, a feeling that was both strange and deeply comforting. The acts of support from the town began as a trickle. The blacksmith's wife, a stern but kind woman, made the trek halfway up the mountain to deliver a basket of fresh bread and cheese. From Sarah, she said gruffly, but her eyes were kind. You're not alone in this. The gesture moved Ilara to tears. They were not just outcasts hiding on a mountain anymore. They were part of a fight. Ilara was no longer just a survivor waiting to be rescued. She was an active participant in her own life. She had made the small cabin a place of warmth and comfort. She taught the children their letters using a charred stick on a piece of smooth bark. She found she had a knack for it, a patience she didn't know she possessed. She was becoming more than a victim, she was becoming a mother, a teacher, a woman of resilience. Caleb returned late one evening, weary but with that same fire of determination in his eyes. He did not tell her everything, only that people in town were now on their side. That night, as he sat by the fire checking the mechanism of his rifle, the children approached him. They had been watching him for a while, whispering to each other. Lily, always the bolder one, reached out and touched his large, calloused hand where it rested on the rifle stock. You're strong, Leo said, his voice serious. You keep us safe. Caleb stopped what he was doing and looked at the boy. Then Lily spoke the words that would change everything. She looked up at his stern, bearded face with complete, unwavering trust. You're coming with us, she said, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. Leo nodded in agreement. We need a daddy like you. They were not asking him to be their father. They were telling him he already was. They were claiming him. They did not mean coming with us to the hearing, but coming with them into their future, into the family they were forming right here in this cabin. The word struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. They bypassed the walls around his heart, the fortress of grief he had maintained for so long. He looked at their small, earnest faces, and he did not see the ghosts of the family he had lost. He saw a new family, a family that needed him, a family that had chosen him. A profound, aching tenderness filled the hollow spaces inside him. He reached out and rested his hand on Leo's head, a gesture of benediction. He could not speak past the lump in his throat. He just nodded. It was all the answer they needed. The day of the hearing dawned cold and clear. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The entire town of Redemption Creek, it seemed, had gathered in the small, unfinished church that served as a town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and tension. People stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway. Ilara sat on a hard wooden bench in the front row, Leo on one side, Lily on the other. They were dressed in their cleanest, most mended clothes. She was terrified, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was the fear of a soldier before a battle, not a lamb before the slaughter. Caleb stood beside her. He was not wearing his buckskins, but a simple wool shirt and trousers Sarah had given him. He looked less like a mountain man and more like a settler, a man who belonged. He held the green leather ledger in his hands. Across the aisle, Marcus Thorne sat with a smug, slick-haired lawyer from back east. Thorne surveyed the crowded room with an air of theatrical boredom, as if the proceedings were a mere formality. He believed completely in the power of his forged documents and the influence of the railroad. The territorial judge, a man named Sterling, was old and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. He called the hearing to order, his voice a low gravel. Thorne's lawyer went first. He presented his case with a river of legalistic jargon, waving the forged indenture contract. He painted Ilara as a desperate woman and Caleb as a violent, lawless brute who had interfered in a legitimate business transaction. It was a plausible, ugly story. When he was finished, the judge turned his tired eyes to Caleb. "And your response?" Caleb did not speak. He walked to the front and placed the ledger on the judge's bench. "The truth," he said. Then he turned and looked at Ilara. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was her turn. It was her story to tell. Ilara stood up, her legs trembling. She took her children's hands, drawing strength from their small, warm grip. Her voice, when she began to speak, was a whisper. "My husband, Samuel, was a good man," she started. The room was utterly silent. "He borrowed money from Mr. Thorne for seed. He promised to pay it back from our first crop." As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, clearer. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply stated the facts of her life, her husband's death, and Thorne's predatory arrival. She spoke of his threats, of being treated like livestock in the middle of the street. She spoke with a simple, unadorned dignity that was more powerful than any lawyer's argument. "He says he owns us," she finished, her voice ringing with defiance. "But a person cannot be owned. My children are not property." She sat down, her heart hammering. The judge looked from her face, raw with honest emotion, to Thorne's, which was now tight with anger. He opened the ledger. He read the entry on Ilara's husband. Then he flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rising higher and higher. He read for a long, silent minute. Finally, he looked up, not at Thorne, but at the crowded room. "This ledger seems to detail many irregularities," Judge Sterling said, his voice laced with cold iron. "Does anyone else here have business with Mr. Thorne that they would like to share with the court?" A thick silence fell. Ilara's heart sank. Had it not been enough? Then, from the back of the room, a loud scraping sound. Thomas, the blacksmith, stood up. His face was grim. "I do, Your Honor," he said, his voice booming through the church. He walked to the front and told the story of his wagon, of the manipulated fees, of the threats. When he finished, the baker stood up. Then one of the farmers. Then another. It was a wave, a tide of courage that swept through the room, washing away years of fear. One by one, the people of Redemption Creek stood and spoke their truth, their stories weaving together into a damning tapestry of greed and corruption. Thorne's face had gone from smug to pale to ashen. His lawyer was shuffling his papers, his professional composure completely gone. The town was no longer a collection of frightened individuals. It was a community, united in defiance. They had found their voice. Judge Sterling slammed the ledger shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He stared down at Marcus Thorne with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "This court finds that you have engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud, extortion, and perjury. The indenture contract for Elara Hale and her children is null and void." He pointed a finger at Thorne. "And I am issuing a warrant for your immediate arrest." Thorne leaped to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You can't do this." "The railroad will." He didn't get to finish. He made a desperate bolt for the door, but his path was blocked. Thomas the blacksmith stood there, his massive arms crossed over his chest. Behind him stood the baker and a half-dozen other townsmen. Thorne's power, built on paper and fear, had vanished. He was just a man, trapped and defeated. The law, for once, had served the just. Outside the church, the afternoon sun felt warm and full of promise. The air was clean. The people of the town, their faces alight with relief and a newfound sense of collective strength, gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. They had taken their town back. Elara stood with Leo and Lily, watching the deputy leader shackled and sputtering Thorne away. A great weight lifted from her soul, a burden she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Caleb walked toward them, moving through the small crowd. People nodded to him, clapping him on the shoulder. He was no longer the strange outsider, but their quiet champion. He stopped in front of Elara. The noise of the town faded away, leaving them in a small bubble of silence. There were no grand declarations, no flowery speeches. Their bond had been forged in shared peril and quiet acts of kindness, not in words. He looked at her, his stormy eyes clear and calm. Then he looked down at the twins, who were beaming up at him. "There's room in the cabin," he said, his voice low and steady. "If you'll stay." It was a simple question, but it held the weight of a lifetime. He was not offering sanctuary anymore. He was offering a home. A future. A family. Elara felt a smile spread across her face, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes for the first time in over a year. She looked at the strong, quiet man who had saved them, and at the two beautiful children whose lives stretched before them, now full of possibility. "We're home," she replied. Months later, the first heavy snow of winter blanketed the high peaks, turning the world outside the cabin into a vast expanse of pristine white. Inside, the little home was an island of warmth and life. The air was filled with the scent of Elara's baking bread and the faint, clean smell of pine from the firewood stacked by the hearth. The sound of Leo and Lily's laughter echoed off the log walls as they played a game with their small collection of carved animals. The silence of grief had been permanently replaced by the gentle hum of happiness. Caleb sat near the fire, meticulously repairing the leg of a small chair he had built for Lily. A small, unaccustomed smile touched his lips as he worked, his movements patient and content. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. The love for his lost wife and child remained, a quiet, sacred memory, but it no longer defined him. It had been joined by a new love, a living, breathing love that filled the empty spaces in his heart. Elara stood in the doorway, watching him. She wore a dress made from fabric Sarah had sent up, the deep blue color of the summer sky. She saw not the forbidding mountain man she had first met, but a kind, gentle soul who had found his way back from a desolate wilderness of sorrow. They had built this life together, a home founded not on law or paper, but on courage, choice, and a deep, unspoken understanding. They were a family, forged in the crucible of adversity and tempered by love. A family that had chosen each other, a home built on the solid rock of mutual respect and a shared hope for all the sunrises to come.